The film opens in 1969 at the entrance of a French prison. Carl Hanratty is surrounded by French police who are questioning his identity. He identifies himself as an FBI agent from the United States and states he has orders to visit an American prisoner, Frank Abagnale. After this, he is allowed inside, and a guard leads him down a corridor. At the cell, the guard places a small stool for Carl and warns him, "Do not open the door and do not pass anything through the small window." Then he leaves. Inside, Frank looks extremely weak and is coughing violently from the cold. Carl ignores this and begins reading the extradition warrant. He starts with the first article, explaining that extradition is granted for serious crimes. Between coughing fits, Frank begs for help, but Carl doesn't believe him and tells him to stop it. He continues reading and mentions there are 16 pages left before moving to the second article. While Carl reads, Frank suddenly loses consciousness. Carl immediately calls for a doctor. Guards rush in, carry Frank out, and place him on a hospital cot. After setting him down, the men wash their hands, saying they are getting rid of lice. Carl insists that Frank must be taken to America for proper treatment, but an officer replies that a doctor will come the next day. Carl refuses to accept this and warns that if anything happens to Frank, the officer will be held responsible. While they are talking, Frank slips out through a back door during the commotion.
Frank.
Soon, he is seen running through the prison while other inmates cheer him on. For a moment, it looks like he might escape, but the guards catch up to him. One of them points a gun at his head, leaving him no choice. Frank stops, lies on the floor, and tells Carl that it's time to go home. The scene then shifts to 6 years earlier, in 1963. A man stands on a stage discussing the history of the New Rochelle Rotary Club, which dates back to 1919. He explains that over the years, only a few worthy individuals have been honored as life members. 57 names are already on the wall, and tonight, another will be added. They announce Frank Williams Abagnale. He takes the stage to the audience's applause. In his speech, he thanks everyone, including his half-French wife Paula, and his son, Frank Jr. When he finishes, the room applauds again, and Frank Jr. runs up to hug his father as he steps down. Later at home, the atmosphere is calm, music is playing, Frank Jr. is dancing with his mother, and his father is telling the story of how he first met Paula. After a while, Frank Jr. sits down to listen. In the middle of the story, Paula accidentally spills wine on the carpet. Frank Jr. goes to get something to wipe it up. When he returns, he stops and quietly watches his parents dancing together. Everyone is happy. The next morning, the father wakes his son early and tells him to skip school. They have an important outing. They drive into the city and go to a tailor for a suit, but a woman refuses them because the shop isn't open yet. Frank Sr. tries to persuade her, calmly explaining there has been a death in the family and he needs the suit for a funeral that same day. She listens but still refuses, saying they don't rent out suits and the shop is closed. As she turns to leave, Frank Sr. calls out to her and shows her a necklace, claiming he found it in the parking lot.
Must have slipped right off your neck.
After this, they manage to leave with what they need. The son plays the role of the driver and takes his father to the bank. When they arrive, the father asks him to get out and open the car door for him, which he does. Frank Jr. asks what's next, but his father tells him to stop smiling and wait in the car. Before going in, he warns, "Don't touch the car, even if a policeman writes tickets." Then he shares a brief lesson, explaining that people often judge by appearances, using the Yankees uniform as an example. Soon the bank manager comes out to greet him and opens the door. Inside, Frank Sr. tries to get a loan, but he is denied due to issues involving tax fraud. Seeing no way out, he eventually gives up the car. Outside, Frank Jr. is confused and asks why his father allowed this. The father calmly replies that they lost nothing. On the contrary, they came out ahead, saying they even made an extra $500. Then he tells his son it's time to return the suit. Shortly after, the family's situation worsens. They are forced to leave their home due to financial problems related to the investigation. In their new apartment, Frank Sr. returns home and finds his son in the kitchen cooking. He asks where Paula is, and Frank Jr. says he isn't sure. She only said she went to look for a job. They joke and laugh about it. Despite the changes, Frank Sr. remembers it is his son's 16th birthday. He hands him a checkbook and says he has opened a small account for him with a small balance. Soon, Frank Jr. has to attend a public school. His mother drives him, and while she's smoking, he takes her cigarette and throws it away, reminding her she promised to quit. She notices he is wearing his old school blazer and tells him to take it off, but he refuses, saying he's used to it. When he enters the school, he tries to ask for directions, but a bully shoves him. When he finally reaches the classroom, it is noisy and in total chaos. The bully remarks that he looks like a substitute teacher. Frank takes this comment seriously and turns it into something else. He steps forward and begins portraying the teacher. The class gradually quietens and starts to listen. He continues teaching as if he actually works there, even teaching French. The same bully who shoved him earlier is called to the chalkboard. Frank asks him to stand and read in front of everyone, putting him in an embarrassing position. As the boy struggles to read, the class bursts into laughter. At that moment, the real substitute teacher appears. She is an elderly woman who explains she was sent because a teacher was needed for Roberta. Frank quickly replies that he usually covers for her and turns to the bully, asking why he stopped reading. The woman gets annoyed and leaves, saying she won't be back. The class reacts with laughter. Several weeks pass before the school finally contacts his parents. The principal explains that Frank Jr. has been pretending to be a substitute teacher all this time. He kept an attendance record, met with parents, and even organized a field trip. Outside the office, Frank Jr. sits quietly. A student approaches Mrs. Davenport with a note, asking for permission to skip 2 classes for a doctor's visit. Frank notices and tells her to fold the note. He points out that the note looks suspicious because it isn't folded at all. The student insists the note is from her mother, but Frank explains that real notes are usually folded and carried a certain way. She listens and follows his advice. A few moments later, Frank's parents walk out of the principal's office. His mother is clearly upset, but his father seems impressed. He can't hide it, and soon they are both laughing as they walk away. Later at home, Frank Jr. goes inside and takes some papers from a shelf. He casually mentions he asked a girl out, and they are going to the school dance. Checking what he took, he realizes it's his driver's license. He then heads to his parents' room. Inside, everything feels different. He enters and catches his mother with his father's friend, Jack Barnes. Jack explains he came to talk business with his father, and she says she was just showing him the apartment. As Jack is about to leave, Frank Jr. asks him to wait and picks up a small pin from the sofa. He returns it, and Jack says with relief that it's an important item, and he would have been in trouble if he'd lost it. After Jack leaves, Frank Jr. sits down and opens an envelope. His mother tries to explain, saying that Jack came to discuss business and thinks they need to hire a lawyer to handle their situation. Frank Jr. is confused and anxious. She asks him not to tell his father. Before leaving, she says they will all have dinner together later and gives him $10 for groceries. He goes to his room, still trying to process what happened. Soon he returns home again and notices a coat on the sofa. Then another man, Dick Kesner, comes out of his parents' room. This time, Frank reacts quickly and tells him not to move. The man stays calm and introduces himself. He gently leads Frank to his parents, and they explain he is a lawyer. Then the truth is revealed. His parents are getting divorced. He is asked to write on a piece of paper which parent he wants to live with. The moment is too heavy for him. Instead of choosing, he runs out of the house. He makes it to the station and buys a ticket to Grand Central for $3.50. The action moves to 1969. Frank is sitting in handcuffs, shackled to a table in a hotel room. He asks Carl when he can call his father. Carl replies that he can when they return to New York and adds that they will leave for the airport in 7 hours. Frank complains about the room, but Carl says it's all the FBI budget allows for. The story flashes back again. Alone, Frank spends months moving from one hotel to another, trying to live off the checkbook his father gave him. But there is no real money in the account, and every check he writes is invalid. Over time, he begins trying to look older so people will take him seriously. He experiments with altering details on documents and checks, learning step by step, but most early attempts fail, and banks turn him away. One day, after another rejection, he notices a pilot entering a bank with a group of flight attendants. People's reaction to them is completely different. They are surrounded by attention and respect. Frank watches closely, and the moment sticks with him. He begins thinking about how to use this image for himself. A few days later, Frank writes to his father. In the letter, he says he has decided to become an airline pilot and has applied to several major companies. He adds that things look promising. He also asks about his mother and wonders if his father has spoken to her lately. Elsewhere, Frank starts by pretending to be a student working on a school project. He uses this as a pretext to ask questions and learn about the aviation industry. He interviews a pilot about things that interest him. When he asks about documents, the pilot gives him an expired license for Frank to include a copy in his newspaper.
And what about your ID badge? Do you have an extra one I could borrow?
Oh, no, I can't help you there. It was a special order from Polaroid.
With the information gathered, he starts making calls and eventually finds a way to contact uniform suppliers working with Pan Am. He goes there to get a pilot's uniform. The man serving him looks closely and says he looks too young to be a pilot. Frank quickly replies that he is a co-pilot. The man asks why he's nervous, and Frank counters,
How'd you feel if you lost your uniform first week on the job?
Relax.
The man says the uniform will cost $164. Frank offers to write a check, but the man refuses. No checks, no cash. Instead, he asks for a staff ID so the expenses can be charged directly to his Pan Am account from his salary. Hearing this, Frank relaxes. Soon, Frank is walking the streets in uniform. People notice him and treat him with respect. He then goes into a bank and receives $100. As he leaves, the same bank manager approaches him, greets him warmly, and thanks him. After the bank, he goes to a hotel where Frank talks to the receptionist and asks if he can write a check. The employee tells him that payroll checks can be cashed for up to $300, unlike the $100 limit for personal ones. In his room, Frank begins manufacturing forged payroll checks, supposedly from the airline. To make the check look as authentic as possible, he applies Pan Am decals from model airplanes. The next day, he goes to cash one of the checks. While the bank teller checks it, Frank keeps her attention on him, ensuring she doesn't look too closely at the details. Back in his room, he buys many more model airplanes and continues making checks. He tries again at another bank, but this time, there is no money. The manager suggests he go directly to the airline, saying they look after their employees. Later at the airport, Frank approaches an agent. She asks if he is deadheading to Miami. Not fully understanding, he agrees anyway. It's a free ticket to warm Miami. He is welcomed on board. A flight attendant named Marcy introduces him to the other pilots. When he settles in just before takeoff, Marcy asks what he wants to drink.
Would you like a drink after takeoff?
Milk?
The plane takes off, and Frank flies for the first time, which leaves him greatly surprised. Frank writes to his father again, telling him he has finished training and is working as a co-pilot with a salary of $1,400 a month plus benefits. He adds that his family can now fly for free and says he plans to take both parents to Hawaii for Christmas. Walking through the plane, Marcy greets him and asks if he's enjoying the free flight. Using a trick he learned from his father, Frank shows her a necklace and asks if she dropped it, expertly placing it around her neck.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
They make a mess. Then Frank stops because he wants to tell her something, stating it's the best date of his life. In a bank, Frank enters and carefully watches the staff until he finds someone to approach. He introduces himself as Frank Taylor, a Pan Am co-pilot, and says he'd like to cash a check and perhaps take her to dinner. She reacts positively and leads him to a MICR machine, explaining that special ink is used to print the numbers at the bottom of checks. Frank asks where exactly those numbers are. She leads him behind the counter, showing him how checks are made, and then playfully places a paper against her chest, saying, "Right here," and he plays along, tapping it with his finger. She explains they are called routing numbers. When he asks where the checks go after that, she doesn't have a clear answer. At an auction, a MICR encoder from Jersey Central Bank is up for sale, and Frank places a bid on it. At the same time, at FBI headquarters, Carl Hanratty begins paying more attention to the rising number of forged checks. While others don't think it's a big deal, Carl remains focused and continues to track the pattern. His colleagues mock him and don't take him seriously. One day, Frank meets his father at an expensive restaurant, and surprises him with a brand new 1965 Cadillac DeVille convertible. The father appreciates the gift, but refuses to keep it, fearing it will attract the attention of the IRS. He says he'd rather take the train home. During the conversation, the subject turns to Paula, and the father gets emotional. Even then, he insists he will keep trying to win her back and rebuild the family. Frank still holds on to that hope. They share a toast, and when asked where he's going next, Frank says he's heading to Hollywood. Meanwhile, Carl continues his investigation, following the trail of bad checks and eventually tracking Frank to a hotel room. As he approaches, Frank passes an elderly blind man in the hallway before entering his room.
Yeah, come on, Carl. This guy's a pen and ink man, a goddamn paper hanger. He doesn't even carry a gun.
Let me go with you, Carl.
You just keep your eyes open, do your job, and I'll buy you both a good humor bar.
A few moments later, Carl bursts in with a gun and searches the room. Frank calmly steps out and claims to be a Secret Service agent named Barry Allen. Carl suspiciously asks for ID. Before the situation escalates, Frank points out the window and says his partner is already leading the suspect away. Carl looks and sees the blind man being put into a car, which makes him believe Frank for a moment. Frank takes advantage of the moment and leaves, handing his wallet to Carl and saying he trusts him with it. When Carl checks the wallet, he finds it empty and realizes he's been fooled again. Frank continues to build his fake pilot identity, learning more about the role by pretending to be a student and asking questions. Eventually, one of the people he interviews gets tired of him and asks him to leave, but not before handing him a newspaper article about a con artist posing as a pilot, calling him the James Bond of the sky.
Did you say?
Bond. James Bond.
The article gives Frank even more confidence, especially since it compares the criminal to a stylish spy. He fully inhabits the persona, buying expensive clothes and living large. He checks into a hotel where he meets a woman and strikes up a conversation.
You're that model, right? Cheryl. You guys used to put your picture on their lockers.
At the same time, Carl is at a laundromat thinking about the case, while Frank enjoys his moment at the hotel with the woman he just met. She notices a card in the room and starts asking about money. Then she makes it clear what she wants for the night. Frank offers her $300, then $500, then $600, but she agrees for $1,000. He tries to cash a check for $1,400, but she says it's too late. It's 3 a.m., and the hotel won't process it. She suggests he endorse the check over to her. Frank points out the amount is more than they agreed, so she gives him $400 back in cash and takes the check. He ends up doubly ahead.
Is it your eyes?
Meanwhile, Carl finishes up at the laundromat. That same night, Carl is alone at work when Frank calls him. Frank apologizes for what he's done and offers to meet, but Carl doesn't take it seriously. He tells Frank that he's likely calling because he has no one else to call, and this clearly hits a nerve. Frank hangs up in anger, leaving Carl feeling he was right. The next day, Carl is in a diner researching the name Barry Allen. A young waiter notices and says it's the name of a comic book character known as the Flash. This moment makes Carl realize the person he's chasing is much younger than he thought. With this new insight, Carl changes his approach and starts checking records of missing children. This leads him to Frank's mother, Paula, who is now married to Jack. She cooperates and provides a photo of Frank from a school yearbook, giving the FBI a clear portrait to work with. At that point, everything falls into place, and he informs Paula that her son is forging checks. She thinks she can repay the damage, but Carl tells her the amount has reached $1.3 million. During this time, Frank is spending money recklessly and throwing parties. At one of them, a friend gets injured, and Frank ends up at a hospital. There, he meets a volunteer named Brenda. She is upset because she thinks she might lose her job in her very first week. Frank comforts her, then asks her to check some hospital records for his friend, which she does. They start to grow closer. Seeing an opportunity, Frank asks if there are any openings at the hospital and claims to be a doctor. Tired of being on the run, Frank starts thinking about settling down. In a letter to his father, he admits he wants a more stable life. He manages to get a position at the hospital under a fake name, taking a role far above his real knowledge. The only condition for such a senior doctor is selecting his own subordinates.
Miss Mace. Miss Strong.
Here.
Nurse Brown.
Since he knows nothing about medicine, he starts watching TV shows about it in the evenings to pick up the lingo. His relationship with Brenda grows stronger. One evening, during a rainstorm, she comes to bring him a report. He notices she has had her braces removed, and the atmosphere becomes awkward. Frank leans in and kisses her. They share a brief moment of intimacy before he is suddenly called to the ER. Faced with a serious situation, he avoids exposure by speaking convincingly, repeating phrases from the TV show. After leaving the room, he goes to the restroom, clearly shaken by what he just saw. While Frank builds this new life, Carl continues to make progress. He visits Frank's father, and during the conversation, he starts to understand where Frank gets his mindset. Frank's father avoids direct answers. As Carl is about to leave, he notices letters from Frank on the table and carefully reads the address. Frank's father makes it clear he won't betray his son, no matter what. Immediately after leaving the apartment, Carl calls his partner, Sean. He asks him to check the address he just found and says he will go to the airport to meet the team in 4 hours. Back with Frank, Brenda is lying in bed, upset and crying under the covers. She says she isn't sure she can go through with this. Frank tries to comfort her, thinking she's worried about being a virgin, and says they can wait. But the reason is different.
I'm not a virgin.
She then reveals she had an abortion 2 years ago. She shares that her parents made the decision for her, involved someone they knew, and then kicked her out of the house. The memories clearly still haunt her. Frank listens and comforts her, then suggests that maybe he could talk to her parents and try to fix things. He becomes more serious and even proposes to her. Soon Carl and his team arrive at Frank's apartment, but he isn't there. They search the place. Carl notices a framed certificate on the wall for Frank's sham medical degree and examines it closely. Later, in New Orleans, Frank meets Brenda's parents for dinner. They ask him to say grace, and he gives a short fabricated speech before they start eating. During the conversation, Brenda's mother asks which hospital in town he plans to work at. Frank casually mentions he might go back to law, which surprises Brenda but impresses her parents. The mother suggests her husband offer him a spot at his law firm. To test him, Brenda's father asks if Frank knows a certain Hollingsworth and even asks about his dog. Frank thinks fast and says the dog died, and the answer satisfies them. Carl appears at the hospital where Frank worked and walks through the halls. He enters Frank's office, but once again, Frank is gone. Later, Brenda's father speaks with Frank privately and directly asks who he really is. He's figured him out. This time, Frank admits he isn't who he claimed to be and says he's just a man who loves his daughter. Her father takes this as a humble answer rather than a confession and gives his approval.
You know what you are. You're a romantic.
Frank passes the bar exam in Louisiana. Returning to the future, December 26, 1969, he is on a plane to New York with Carl. Carl asks how he managed to pass the exam. Frank replies, it doesn't matter since he's going to jail anyway. He then offers to tell him if Carl gives him half of his eclair. Carl ignores the deal, eats the eclair himself, and says he'll figure it out sooner or later. Back to the past, Frank starts working at Brenda's father's law firm. He is appointed as an assistant prosecutor. During his first court session, he speaks concisely to the judge based on his experience, but the judge corrects him, explaining it's a preliminary hearing where no one is present.
What in the hell is wrong with you?
At Brenda's house, he begins to feel out of place watching her family spend time together. It reminds him of what he once had, and despite everything he's built, he feels a quiet sense of loss. Later, Frank meets his father in a bar. He is full of enthusiasm and hope. His father now has a job and mentions he needs a lawyer for his tax issues. Frank says he can help and invites him to sit. He hands him an engagement invitation and talks about the wedding, buying a new Cadillac, and moving into a $60,000 house. He talks about getting everything back to the way it was, but his father tells him the truth. Paula has already remarried to his friend, Jack Barnes, and the FBI is still looking for him. This news hits Frank hard. He admits he's tired of running and wants to stop, but his father tells him to keep going. After that, they part ways. On Christmas Eve, Frank calls Carl again. He's trying to find peace and says he's getting married and wants to settle things. Carl replies that he can't stop because his job is to catch Frank. Frank accepts this and ends the call by wishing him a Merry Christmas. This call gives Carl an idea. Since Frank plans to marry, he might use his real name, which would make him easier to find. Carl follows this lead and tracks him down during the wedding preparations with Brenda. As soon as Frank spots Carl nearby, he quickly heads to his room, with Brenda following. Inside, he finally tells her the truth. He confesses he is only 17 and shows her the money he's been hiding. Brenda believed he was older and living under a different name. Frank asks her to trust him one last time and meet him at the airport in 2 days so they can leave together. Before he leaves, she asks for his real name, and he gives it. They say goodbye, neither knowing what will happen next. When Carl reaches the room, a dollar bill flies past him. He opens the door, but Frank is already gone. 2 days later, Frank waits at the airport, looking for Brenda. He finally sees her, but something is wrong. He notices signs that she isn't alone and realizes the FBI is nearby. Assessing the situation, he decides not to approach her and quietly leaves. Still trying to escape, Frank comes up with a new plan. He returns to the pilot persona and creates a fake training program, claiming to be recruiting young women for flight attendants. Even as the FBI continues the search, Frank conducts interviews and selects a group of 8 girls to carry out the plan. He conducts a brief interview with each. He then uses the group of young women as a distraction. While all attention is on them, Frank calmly walks through airport security and slips past unnoticed. At this time, Carl gets a call at the airport. He is told to check for a man in a Pan Am uniform sitting in a white Coupe de Ville by the terminal. While he is still on the phone, Frank walks right past him. Carl rushes out to check the tip and finds the person who was paid to pick him up. By the time he realizes what happened, Frank is already gone, having boarded an international flight. Months pass, and most at the FBI begin to lose interest in the case. But Carl persists. Studying the checks Frank used, he notices they aren't entirely fake, but carefully altered. This makes him wonder where the originals come from. Recalling early clues, he begins to believe Frank might be in France, given his mother's background. Carl follows this lead and finds him in a small town in France. On another Christmas Eve, he finds Frank working in a place where large batches of checks are produced. When Carl approaches him, Frank looks tired and exhausted. This time, he doesn't run. He talks calmly with Carl. Carl convinces him to surrender without a fight, warning that local police might not be as patient. Frank agrees, but upon stepping outside, French officers take him into custody. After some time, Carl manages to arrange his transfer back to the United States. During the flight, Carl informs him that his father has passed away. The news deeply affects Frank. Minutes before landing, Frank climbs into the plane's lavatory and escapes through the toilet drain onto the runway, then rushes to find his mother. When he finally sees her, he realizes she has moved on and now has a new family, including a small child. This moment closes the last door he was holding on to. With nowhere left to run, Frank finally surrenders when Carl arrives with other agents. He is sentenced to 12 years in a maximum security prison. While serving his time, Carl visits him occasionally. During one visit, Carl brings a case involving a suspicious check. Frank quickly identifies the problem and points out that someone inside the bank is involved. Seeing this, Carl offers him a deal, help the FBI with fraud cases instead of serving his full sentence. Frank agrees and begins working with them, although some agents don't trust him at first. He gradually gets used to this new life. One day, walking past a storefront, he notices a pilot's uniform, which reminds him of his past. As the weekend approaches, the silence begins to weigh on him, and he feels lonely. This feeling draws him back to his old habits, and he tries once again to assume the role to catch a flight. Before he can do it, Carl stops him. He tells Frank that no one is chasing him anymore, and that by leaving, he would only be going back to where he started. He leaves the choice to him. On Monday, Carl waits, not knowing what Frank will do. In the end, Frank returns. He chooses to stay and continue working with the FBI, gradually building a new path, using the same skills, but in a different way.